I've got another 9 by 12 inch transparent watercolor to share with you today. This is a black crowned night heron. I got a ton of photo reference of a super cooperative bird from Orlando wetlands in Florida while on a trip with my brother Ted. The bird was beginning to collect twigs to build a nest and kept returning to one bare tree looking for branches to snap off. There were probably 10 other photographers raking in the shots. Maybe it's just me, but I find these to be really classy looking birds with fantastic subtle colors that seem to work together perfectly. Those beautiful curving white breeding plumes coming off the head, those are the icing on the cake. Wanting a smooth blurry background, I pre-wet my paper for a wet-on-wet wash. Previously, I transferred the main lines of my drawing from my sketchbook to the block of Kilimanjaro 140-pound cold-pressed paper and masked off the foreground using liquid frisket. I pre-mixed my background sky color using ultramarine blue and a little dioxazine purple. Pushing the blue sky more in the purple direction should help add a nice color contrast to the warm whites that will go onto the bird later. Once the paper was evenly saturated, I washed in my sky color. I used a 1-inch flat brush and started at the top of the page, working my way toward the bottom, allowing gravity to help move the paint down the page. To prevent back runs, I blotted off any extra paint that was puddling, and then brought in some greens as a suggestion of some distant foliage. As those colors mix on the page, it should leave a nice blurry background. While the page was still wet, I used a number 2 round brush to add some blurry branches toward the bottom of the page. I also brought in additional greens to build a little more color and contrast. With the basics in, I hit the background with the hairdryer to lock it all in. I put in a few more greens and darks to build more depth and sort of sculpt out some bundles of leaves, and then hit it again with the hairdryer. Now that the background was mostly set, I removed the frisket and then transferred the foreground sketch to the watercolor paper using a folding bone and a tracing paper transfer. With those on the page, I added a little liquid frisket with a toothpick in a lead holder to mask off the super thin breeding plumes that come off the top of the bird's head. Since I'm using transparent watercolor, I need to preserve the white of the page for that area of detail. Otherwise, you'd need to go with opaque watercolor to cover it up. The first thing I did on the foreground was to use my basic sky colors to add shadows to the bird and all the branches. That'll help build the overall lighting in the scene and unify our colors down the road. A number 2 round brush was used for 99% of the rest of this painting. For smaller formats like this 9 by 12 inch piece, those brushes typically see the most action. Next was to put in the lightest local color over all of the foreground. I started with the white of the belly and neck using a wash of warm tones using yellow ochre, Windsor orange, and lemon yellow. For the legs colors, I put in some cadmium red light and a little burnt sienna. Then a blue-gray was put in for the wings using ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and a little burnt sienna. On the blackish areas of the back and head, I started with the darker mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and dioxazine purple. At this point, everything had its lightest local colors in, and I could start glazing in the next layers of slightly darker colors. I started with the wings and tail. After that, it was time to start building the colors and textures on the branches. These had lichen and algae growing on some parts and were kind of sun-baked in others. I started with the pass of my green, desaturated with some brown from my palette. That was followed up with a darker version of the green, but with a bit more burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to darken it up. With the branches getting more filled out, it was time to add another pass or 2 to the bird. It really helps to move around the page in order to get everything developing at a similar level of detail. It also keeps things from getting boring. If you were only to paint the branches until they were complete, you'd get pretty sick of working on that same thing for hours. By taking a break and working on the bird for a bit, you can come back and look at the branches differently and have more energy to spend on making them look better. My next pass on the branches pulled in more of the darker green browns. Also, to the tips of the branches, I started bringing in some warmer orange browns made with some added cadmium red light, lemon yellow, and burnt sienna desaturated with my green. Now, this color shift was barely visible in the photo reference, but it was visually helpful in distinguishing some of the overlapping areas, and it added some interest, so I chose to brag it up a bit. Those slightly warmer, thinner branches will have a little shared color with the feet and the eye. Common colors can always help things out. Speaking of feet, it was time for another layer of slightly darker colors. I started easing in some scaly patterns using cadmium red medium. Some Windsor orange was mixed with a little cadmium red medium and desaturated a bit with French ultramarine to add a darker bottom edge to the bird. Now that the bulk of the shading was in, I started to work a little more opaquely and was adding more and more tiny details like edging to the wings and the tail feathers. This is a fun stage of the painting because things really start to look more dimensional. Often, areas will have some overlapping textures from the previous washes, and those get a few tiny shadows rendered, and suddenly they start looking like a convincing tuft of feathers. As I start rendering longer straight areas like the beak or the plumes on the bird's back, I'll rotate the page to match the natural movement of my hand. Things tend to slow down a lot at this point in the painting because I'm rendering tight, careful lines with darker colors. Things can go wrong quickly if something's off even a tiny amount, so I just cut back on the speed, which increases your brush's accuracy. With the majority of the bird close to rendered, it was time to remove the frisket that was protecting those 3 white breeding plumes coming from the back of the night heron's head. Once that was removed, the white of the page looks pretty stark against the rest of the painting, so I sharpened up the edges using darker colors and added some shadows to begin incorporating these feathers into the painting more. With a lot of tiny details in the final passes of the painting, I switched to a 10-aught brush. For the eye, I had the basics already rendered with the Windsor orange light part fading to cadmium red at the edges. I brought in more cadmium red medium, fading to alizarin crimson, and eventually some dioxazine purple for the darkest colors on the eye. Still using that 10-aught brush, I brought in some oranges for the shadow edge of the breeding plumes on the head, and then used some purple grays to add more shadows as the feathers overlap. Switching back to my number 2 round brush, I started crisping up all sorts of edges to put in my darkest shadows and fine details. I find that it's always helpful to put away a painting overnight when you're close to finished. Inevitably, I find a lot more things to work on the next day when I dive back into the painting, and at that point I have more energy to work on things. As I inspected the artwork, I felt a few things needed attention. I needed to punch up the darks on the bottom of the bird's belly using some warm colors. Where the feet wrapped around the branches, it needed darkening and crisping up. The shadow under the wing could go a bit darker, and the neck and the breeding plumes on the head needed to be pushed back, and a little more form needed to be rendered on the neck. Finally, a few areas on the branches were ambiguous and they needed to be defined by darks. And with those corrected, I felt like it was finished. This was a really fun bird to paint. Black-crowned night herons are strikingly handsome birds. I'm not entirely sure why it took me so long to get around to rendering one of these guys in watercolor, but it did. Are there any subjects that you've neglected for too long? Drop a comment below. Well, thanks for watching. For anyone interested, I put in a link in the video description below to a newsletter that I started with some tips and other watercolor information if you'd like to sign up. I hope you all get a chance to get out the watercolors and paint soon.